last I knew with Pillsbury Whitman Shaw. Is that still accurate?
No,
So yes, Ed has been a longtime tech lawyer in Austin. He was also in grad school when some of the legal cases here in Austin that led to the founding of EFF and EFF Austin happened. He's been a longtime thought leader in, basically the law around cyberspace and emerging technologies, and has litigated on a lot of interesting stuff over the years. And I reached out to him because he recently, with our fellow board member John Webkowski, he did a session for his Plutopia News Network podcast on cyber law, and I was like, well, I need to have Ed come talk to us about that. And so Ed's basically, I will let him speak, but I believe his plan is that we're going to basically have kind of an open discussion about emerging new technological spaces and the legal implications that are emerging around those technologies, and what we see as the good, the bad, etc. And so I don't want to constrain where the conversation is going, so without further ado, I will sit down and let Ed start to direct in the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. There's almost no way you could constrain where the conversation's going because I have no idea where the conversation's going. But I thought I would start with a few introductory comments, and then we got a small group, and so maybe we can just talk and see where it goes. As Kevin mentioned, I've been involved in this area a long time, and some of it is, I think, relevant because of some of the cycles we've now pulling back and recognize with how the law has evolved in the context of disruptive new technologies. My particular area is computer-mediated communications, the networks, and some of those technologies. And so I thought I'd indulge, if you'll indulge me, I'll give you a little bit of context on kind of how I got involved in it, what I saw early, and how we're maybe seeing some of the same stuff cycle back around as often happens. So I got into this area pretty young. Some of you in the room may have memories that go back to the 80s, early 80s. I was in Deep South Texas and started building IBM PC clones because no one was selling clones back then, or very few people were. But even before then was an old 6502 processor guy. If you know those machines, Apple IIs, Commodore, the VIC-20, and I don't remember all the names of those machines anymore. The Atari 800 and 400, right? These were some really early machines, and they were super fun, and we'd play games on them and program in BASIC and do that kind of thing. But the world really opened up in the early 80s when there was a grassroots movement by some folks way smarter than I was at the time, since I was a high school student, but who recognized that there was an interesting way to link computers via phone lines, right? The early electronic bulletin board systems. Any of you guys old BBS people or know about that? So, correct me if I get into this history wrong, but the idea was that there might be some cool things you might do if you could exchange files first, and that was the original idea, between computers via modem over phone lines. So you could be in your bedroom with your computer, dial up on the modem, connect to someone else's computer, and swap software or do those types of things. And it was a pretty interesting time because this is all pre-internet being publicly accessible. There was early internet stuff happening at the universities, but it was very much a hobbyist and a thing to talk about, connecting our computers via the phone line. And there were some neat things that in a non-commercial, very open development type environment, people started doing with that technology. There was particularly a guy named Tom Jennings who started working on a system called FidoNet, which was, I think, named after his dog or something. And the idea was, hey, these computers can not only connect to one another to share files and information, but we could also message one another. And so it was a very early precursor to email as an application. So each computer that would run the FidoNet software would have its own unique identity on the network, and there was a manual table of all of those computers and their phone numbers, okay? And the computers were set to answer the phone, so you'd have a dedicated phone, and one person's computer could call another person's computer if there was a reason to do that, and the software kind of figured that out. So if I decided I wanted to send a piece of software to Kevin's computer, I knew the name of his system. It was a number. It was usually, some long number. I don't know why we didn't have better naming structure at the time. And I could designate a file on my system to go to his computer, and the machines would take over at night. Usually we'd set a time, and they would dial, and then an automated file transfer would happen. That was pretty cool, right? And then I could also append a message to that, like, hey, Kevin, here's the new code I was working on. Rather than run a floppy disk to your house, and the machine would send it. And that messaging system soon overtook the functionality of the file transfer. And we started recognizing that we could correspond with other people. The real magic of those early networks was that, they worked with phone calls locally, but back then, long distance was metered. And so if you made a long distance phone call, you got charged by the amount of time, which is a crazy concept to people today that was the case. But, if you were in San Antonio and you want to call someone in Austin, there was a charge for that, right? And one of the things that the early bulletin board users and developers recognized is that if you had enough intermittent hops of local calls, you could effectuate a transfer that would have otherwise required a long distance call, because someone in San Antonio could call someone up in San Marcos, and might be a local, and then to New Braunfels, and then to Austin, and that would potentially pass the same packets along without anyone having to pay long distance, and that was pretty cool. But the software had to get pretty smart to do that, because it had to know everyone's phone number, and then had to understand whether it was a long distance or a local hop. And then all of that would get hand modified into a routing chart that would get sent around by the same method. And that system, without any economic incentive other than a bunch of hobbyists, most of them came out of the ham radio world, which is still out there. There are people who still do ham radio, long distance radio. That system developed into first a regional, then a national, and then an international network of thousands and thousands of machines that were all dialing each other on their own. And it was what we call a store and forward network. So, if I wanted to send a file from here to New York, it might take 40 hops or 50 hops. And some people would allow their machines to make long distance calls, usually using illicitly found long distance calling cards or something, but most of it was all local. And without knowing what we were doing in development, and it was community developed, and so everyone was tweaking the software, sending it up to this one guy, Tom Jennings, and saying, hey, I just made this a little bit better, the routing table is a little more efficient. We were creating a distributed network, which was a precursor to what was going on at the universities with TCP/IP, but it was done by people who really didn't know what we were doing, and it just kind of worked. And it spawned multiple similar networks. I became real active in one called the WWIV network. I think at its peak we had 30,000 home computers connected, and the messaging became really interesting. About that time on the internet, someone developed the Usenet Protocol, which is a distributed messaging thing, the precursor to like threaded message boards like Reddit and other things that you see now. And we emulated that same concept on the bulletin boards, and hence their name. Like, there were these places where someone would discuss a particular topic, and they'd post a message, and then that message would distribute out across the network, and everyone would see it, and people would respond. Wasn't fast. You might respond, and a day or two later another reply would come in, but they would show up magically, right? That was a really interesting time, because there were all of these systems running simultaneously. People started writing bridges between them, and for a little bit, the computer bulletin board, network computer bulletin boards, were the only consumer network available, out there. I mean, there just wasn't anything else. The internet was was almost exclusively devoted to military and academic use. You know, high school kids couldn't get an address, couldn't get an email address. You know, I don't think they were even written many email clients at the time. And so there was this huge activity in this hobbyist space, very quickly turned to some, you know, the kinds of things that high school kids would want it to be. So it was very quickly pirated software being exchanged like crazy. You know, lots of text files. People would copy, you know, articles and books into the system, and as you might expect, they were what high schoolers wanted to see. So it was things like the Anarchist Guide to Making a Pipe Bomb, you know, and it'd come through, and you'd say, oh, I can download that and read about how to make or pick a lock, and a lot of the activity was kind of that type of slightly illicit. I mean, software piracy was real illicit. It was illegal, right? But, you know, a new game would come out from Electronic Arts on disk. Someone would, this is before copy protection, would copy it, put it on the system, and then it would spread out, right? And everyone would say, hey, I got this game for free, right? Got pretty into that system when I was living in a small town in South Texas, moved to Austin in 1986, and brought it with me. And there was a good community going in Austin at the time of people who were running those types of systems. And I kind of started getting interested in, and a lot of people started getting interested in, like the legality of what was going on here, because like I said, a lot of it was pretty illicit, and there was some questionable, like, hey, you know, we're all trading games. Could we go to jail for this? You know, and the answer is yes, we could have, but, you know, nobody really knew what we were doing in those systems. And so I developed a real early interest in, you know, whether or not, you know, the laws of the outside world applied in this kind of environment. And that interest led me to law school. I started law school here in 1990 and thought I would learn all about computer bulletin board laws at law school. It turns out nobody at the law school had ever heard of a computer bulletin board. And so there was a small group of us that were very interested in applying what we were learning at law school into that realm. And a lot of that came to a head in the mid-90s, early 90s, when one of the bulletin boards that was a well-known one here in town was raided by the U.S. Secret Service, the Steve Jackson Games bulletin board. If you're a gamer, Steve Jackson does role-playing games. They publish role-playing games. And they had a bulletin board where you could download game files, et cetera. And they had written a game, a role-playing game called Cyberpunk, which was loosely based on some science fiction stuff that was going on. And it was a role-playing game about hacking and doing things like that. And law enforcement got a little confused about what was going on there and thought it was actual hacking manual. If any of you remember, in sometime like 91 or 92, some actual hackers brought down AT&T's telecommunication network. That was a big deal, freaked a lot of people out. And there was a mistaken assumption that AT&T hacking activity somehow related to this game. And so all of a sudden, in our little community of computer bulletin board users, there was this huge event where federal law enforcement agents went in and seized this computer bulletin board system out of this game company. And we all kind of got up in arms about it a little bit, like, hey, what are they doing? This doesn't make any sense. And so I was fascinated by all of that and devoted myself in law school to trying to figure out a way to learn about the law and like how it applied in these new realms. And I wasn't the only one. There were a number of other people. That event, by the way, was the beginning of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which formed to defend the accused game writers who were accused of writing a game that was a hacking instruction game, which it wasn't. And there were some folks here in town that got real involved in that, and I was one of them. And so, you know, had this early interest in this, which just kind of continued on to this day. I tell all that background because it's kind of interesting, but more importantly, because what we were experiencing then as lawyers in training and then young lawyers was, you know, application of law into fact patterns that like had not been contemplated by legislators or judges, right? And it turns out that our legal system is particularly ill-equipped for that endeavor. Because if you know anything about law, we inherited the English legal system, which is a precedential legal system. Not all legal systems in the world are like that. What I mean by that is, in our legal system, legislators write law, but law is interpreted by judges who apply a law when the facts don't really fit, and then they write their interpretation out in what legal opinions of the court, and those opinions become, to put it in, kind of layperson parlance, like the fact for the law, right? It's like, how does the law apply in this situation? Well, it turns out that happened before, a judge has written about it, and the judge says, in this situation, here's how we interpret the law. That collection of insights from judges is legal precedent, and it's the way our legal system, develops. And so the statute's pretty plain, but then the law develops in the cases that interpret the statute, and that's a pretty effective system as long as the world is a pretty stable place. Because as you interpret legal issues related to the cattle industry, which stayed pretty the same for 100 years or 200 years, those precedents all make sense. And it's like, if the law says you go to jail for stealing a head of cattle, and someone comes in and says, well, it was already dead, and I took it when it was dead, and the law didn't address that, some judge says, yeah, that doesn't count, or that does count, whatever, right? And then you can refer on that. But when things in the real world start changing dramatically, as we were seeing with some of this early computer network technologies, the law just doesn't adapt quick enough. And so you have a gap between what the legal system says and the things that are happening out in the world, and it's a pretty significant gap. I'll give you an example of how laws that are written for the real world seem to work well until they run up against new disruptive technologies. You may be familiar with trademark law. Trademark law is a consumer protection doctrine that says it would be bad if people associate a particular good or service with a brand, and then some other person comes along and uses that brand illicitly, without permission, and consumers get fooled into thinking they know what they're getting, but they really aren't, right? So Coca-Cola puts out Coca-Cola. It's got a certain quality and taste. If you like Coca-Cola, you go to the store and you see something in a Coca-Cola bottle and you say, I want Coke, so I'm going to buy that. It would be a bad thing if anyone could say, well, I'm going to put out an inferior drink and call it Coca-Cola, because consumers would be taken by that. And that's the basis of our trademark law, okay? The first user of a good or service, a brand for a good or service, kind of has a little monopoly on that as long as they continue to put it out. But the trademark law kind of said, yeah, but it's all based on whether people can be confused, so it needs to be a similar good or service, which that makes sense, right? If I call my soft drink Coca-Cola and you decide to make a car called a Coca-Cola car, that doesn't cause confusion because no one goes buys a car thinking they're buying a soft drink. And then another thing that the trademark law had hard-coded in it was, and it also has to be in the same geography, right? Because if I open up Ed's hamburger shop in New York and some other guy named Ed opens a hamburger shop in Austin, the odds that a restaurant goer is going to end up at the wrong one is pretty low, because one's in New York and one's in Austin, right? That became a really important part of trademark doctrine. And then we got online, right, where all of a sudden the networks brought goods and services to people regardless of where they were. And so I could sell a good online that really didn't make any sense with regard to geography. But we had 100 years of doctrine saying the geography matters in trademark law. And then overnight, the ability to do distance selling through the internet, and the law freaks out. And people say, wait a minute, which one, the New York one or the Austin one, wins here? Because historically the law has treated them as separate, and all of a sudden the networks brought them together, right? You take problems like that and they multiplied out in a pretty significant way with the advent of a bunch of people coming online to do things. that were physically impossible before, but that the network interactivity facilitated. I'll diverge a little bit here to tell you, I'll go into some legal theory, which I find interesting. Maybe you will too. You know, it turns out that this is as much a philosophical issue as a legal issue, because ultimately laws are intended to curb societally bad behaviors, right? That's what laws are for. It's like, you know, outlawing certain activities can, you know, and we've decided as a society that if people do those activities, we're going to punish them, and the government is empowered to do that. So, you know, you go steal someone's purse, we all as a society agree that's bad, and therefore we're going to say that if you get caught doing that, we can punish you. We also allow people sometimes to have a remedy that doesn't involve the government, but aggrieved individuals can sue each other for bad acts, and the government will enforce that as well. So if I, maybe I don't steal your purse, but I go to the town, you know, hall and say, you know, Kevin's a thief and you should never do business with him. We know that that's also, and if that's not true, right, we also know.
I'm not going to confirm or deny.
Right, you know, we also know that that's a bad behavior, right? But, you know, and laws are intended to do that, but it turns out there's a bunch of other things out there that constrain behaviors beyond the law. In fact, the law really only covers a small amount of bad behaviors, because otherwise it would be way too much law to write, okay? And they're simple but intuitive what those other things are. I mean, I could probably ask and you'd start knowing them. I mean, I will ask, just for fun. What other things other than the law keep people from doing bad stuff?
People yelling at them.
Right, so this is one of them, social norms, right? There are certain activities that might not be illegal, but society frowns on them because we've kind of just decided those are bad things, right? And so, you know, walking up to someone carrying a baby and saying, that's a really ugly baby, you know? And, you know, not illegal, but if you do that in a crowd, people are gonna shun you for doing that. And it turns out a lot of unsavory behavior is precluded by just social norms. What else other than law and social norms?
Rules.
What, I'm sorry?
Rules.
Yeah, laws are kind of rules, but there are other informal rule sets or formal rule sets that might apply, right? You know, the more formal ones are like religion, you know, and some of those ethical systems that say, you know, do unto others as you want them to do unto you, or whatever those rules are. And that some people adopt those not because the law says you have to, but because they just follow that rule set, you know, and some of them religious, some of them are social. There's other kinds of rules as well. There are a couple others too. I mean, there's maybe not so well defined. There's ethics and morals, you know. I mean,
One's personal morality.
Yeah, your own,
independent of religion,
right, or anything
you
else.
Enforce it, no outside source.
This is what, like, you know, you're walking down the street and you find a wallet, and you got an option at that point to like put in your pocket, or maybe you say, you know, I don't feel good about that. Open it up, see a name. I try to reach out to the person, right? The law doesn't require you to do that. Maybe the religion doesn't speak to that, but you just kind of feel crappy for doing the wrong thing. And so that governs a lot too. And those are all interesting and good, but there's one no one's mentioned that it actually,
Your mood, if you're hungry versus not.
I think internal, yeah, some of your motivations are important, but there's one even more fundamental than that. And
Architecture, people.
I'm sorry?
Architecture.
Yeah, close, real close. I mean, you're in the right zone though.
The environment,
It's,
the natural or artificial environment.
yeah, all of those things, which I think is probably best described by talking to them about physics. Ultimately, it's physics, right? And in fact, there is something really interesting about all of these systems, which is we use the same word for almost all of them. So there's the laws of physics, right? And there's religious and moral codes, which is another, like the federal law in this country is called the US Code, right? We tend to use the same word for these constraints, and the laws of physics are pretty immutable, right? So I'll give you an example of the types of things, and by the way, it's the big one. You know, more than anything else, the laws of physics restrain behaviors, not just good behaviors or bad behaviors, but any kind of behaviors, right? I'll give you a great example. We're walking downtown Austin, there's a big skyscraper, and you say, wonder what would happen if I leapt up in the air, jumped over the skyscraper, and landed on the other side. Well, if we really thought about that, we'd probably say that's pretty bad behavior. Who knows what you're going to land on? There could be a baby in a stroller or something. And if we thought about it enough, we might say we should pass a law about that. Or religion would say on the list of things not to do is jump over tall buildings. We don't have any of those rules. Why? Because you can't jump over tall buildings. It's not a problem that needs to be addressed, right? The laws of physics constrain a lot of that kind of stuff. It would, we probably would consider it bad behavior if you could walk by, the women's dressing room or the men's dressing room and stand outside the wall and look in and see what's going on inside there. But you can't. There's a wall there and you can't see through it. So we don't need rules saying you can't look through the wall and invade someone's privacy, because it's physically impossible. Computer networks and computer-mediated communications, and especially as we developed them over time and continue to develop them, really challenge that basic fundamental rule, because in a lot of computer-mediated environments, those physics rules don't apply, okay? You can do things that you couldn't do in the physical world, like sell an item to someone who's across the world, like communicate with someone in real time with someone who's across the world. It just didn't happen before in any other meaningful way. And so we don't have rules, we don't have laws, we don't have developed ethical codes, we don't even know how we feel about it, because there's been no training. And when computer-mediated communications and the networks facilitated those behaviors, it was like those behaviors fell on a completely blank slate. We didn't know if they were right or wrong. We didn't know if they were legal or illegal. The religion didn't have anything to say about it. There were these behaviors, and every new advancement in network technology broke down physical barriers and facilitated activities that weren't possible in the real world. And when those things had to be looked at as to whether they are societally good or bad or not, we didn't know the answer, okay? And by the way, it seemed mind-blowing to those of us looking at the law then. The magnitude of those types of changes now is even greater than ever was, particularly with virtual environments, which I'll talk about in a minute, because it really changed stuff. By the way, there's interesting, and a lot of this theory is not mine. There's great writing on this, particularly if you're interested in any of this stuff. There's a great book by a guy named Larry Lessig, who is the law professor at Harvard, who wrote this wonderful book called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, where he did all this analysis. He points out that, in fact, there are, though, an equivalent set of rules in virtual environments on the internet to physics that can constrain those behaviors. It's just a different type of rule set. What is it? The code. And funny enough, it's the same word that we use for all these other systems. It's the software, right? You can do things online if the software allows you to do it online. If the software doesn't allow you to do it, then the lack of capability for doing that is constrained, just like the laws of physics. Except, who writes the laws of physics? Depending on your worldview, it's either God or science or something, right? And who writes code? It's like Kevin.
Programmers like me.
Yeah.
Or maybe a loophole I didn't think of.
Right. And so, we are in this interesting world where the only analog constraint to the biggest regulator of behavior, physics, has been replaced by a man-made system of software, right? And it is not a trivial thing, it's a profound thing when you think about you really can't do anything online or on the internet or in a virtual world that the programmers didn't make happen.
Either intentionally or unintentionally.
Intentionally or unintentionally, right?
But it's still a direct deterministic consequence.
It's all based on the code. So, one of the things we struggled with tremendously in early internet days was jurisdiction and choice of law. You know, in the real world, that's another system that was set up around physics, right? If you're in Texas, there are rules that apply to you. You go to Oklahoma, there are different laws that apply because those states have different laws. You go to China, and there's way different laws that apply. And that all worked fine when we were physically acting in an environment. So if you steal something in Texas, Texas has got a criminal code that says that's illegal. 5 years in jail for stealing this much. Maybe in California it's different. Maybe in China it's way different, like they kill you, you know, right? But that system worked for all of human history because we knew where you were. But if you get online and do some of those types of activities, you know, your victim might be in one jurisdiction and you're in another, right? And if the code allows you to do harmful activities, then there's a huge issue of what jurisdiction should apply to that issue. It doesn't have to be a huge issue. One of the issues, by the way, that makes it complicated is you don't even know necessarily where the other person is, right? But I say that as if that's a natural thing, and of course it's not natural. You don't know to the extent the software isn't coded to tell you. In theory, the software could be coded to give you much specificity about where the other person that you're dealing with is. Just not the way it was written, right? If it was, we might have clearer jurisdictional analysis. Anonymity online, a lot of the issues that we face with jurisdiction online, a lot of the things people do with computers to invade privacy, et cetera, those are all a function of the code that's written, which either allows it or it doesn't. By the way, Lessig took this conversation one step further, which I won't delve into, but he pointed out that, and he was writing this pretty early, he said, you know, the more that's true, the more likely that the legislators will give up trying to regulate the behaviors in those environments, and they'll regulate the code, right? Because that's easier, it works better. And in fact, we saw that in spades in the early 90s, and we continue to see it this day, where legislators said, wait, people are trading pirated software all over the place via peer-to-peer networks? You know, remember the Napster and the music and all that stuff, right? And at first it was like, well, let's go after all those pirates. Well, it turns out the systems weren't coded to where the identity of those people were clear. There were no centralized logs, so they were peer-to-peer networks. Enforcement became impossible, so what did they try to do? They tried to make writing code that let you do it illegal, right? They went behind the scenes to regulate code. A lot of this area is the study of how, at what level is the regulation going to apply? Should we apply it to individual activities? Should we apply it to code? So copyright infringement's illegal. People didn't seem to care. Remember, there's no hard-coded religious opinion about whether copying a song is legal or illegal. People don't grow up thinking it's right or wrong. You know, everyone knows that stealing an apple at the market is morally wrong, but no one was really sure whether copying a song from someone else's server was morally wrong. And so if the code allowed you to do it, right, and there were definitely laws about it, but there was just, you know, people didn't care. They didn't have a basis to have a moral opinion about it. And we saw that in spades with young people, you know, massively ignoring copyright law. And so they started regulating the code. They started doing things like, well, let's make it impossible to copy the song. Whether the law lets you or not, we'll build in digital rights management into the file so it can't be copied. In fact, that's how they responded to the bulletin board system software phenomenon, which I was heavily involved in, is all of a sudden you couldn't copy the disk anymore. They put copy protection on it, right? You know, that was the market in trying to create physics there. And then there were some early movements, thank God they didn't catch on, where the government said maybe we should mandate that all copyrighted material come with DRM built into it, right? But there are a bunch of examples like that still going on where how to regulate this behavior, where there's a vacuum of ethical and moral and physical constraints that normally regulate behavior, is a real problem for the law, which doesn't move quickly. Legislators don't react quickly. They don't understand these technologies. Judges don't understand them. They write bad opinions because they don't understand it, and it takes a long time. And by the time their law develops in any particular area, the technology has moved along, right? And so there is a dearth of well thought out regulation in this area, which has made some people think, well, then there's just no rules at all, right? And in fact, early on in the formative days of the internet, a bunch of people, smart people, like John Perry Barlow and others, who kind of said, it's all bets are off. Like this stuff, what you do online, what you do in this new place, which isn't really a place, but we named it, cyberspace or the internet or whatever, doesn't fit with our law, and therefore there is no law, right? Of course, that idea was controversial to say the least, but there were a lot of people that bought in and said, yeah, if someone got something on the internet and they put it out there, then it's free for anyone, right? You go to a website and see an image, they put it on the internet, it must be free. Despite the fact that we have well-established copyright law about who owns the image, there's case law that says who owns the image, there was something about that environment where people thought those rules don't apply anymore. And all of that was fascinating theoretically, and then became pretty significant when society and business moved into that realm, because we actually had real things happening, not just a bunch of kids playing, but like business happening, people living out their lives in those environments, people, their reputation in those environments mattered. And we were doing things, and we still are doing things, that the law just didn't contemplate. Here's another great example, right? The ability to defame someone used to be a rich person's game. I could defame you in a small group. I could go into this group right here and say, I don't know if you guys know, but Kevin is a thief. Don't trust him. That's defamatory.
I'll admit it. I downloaded songs off the internet.
We all did, right? I can defame him in that group, but the ability to defame Kevin in a big way required me to have the ability to publish in a big way, and it was really relegated to the press, right? I mean, I could do some damage, and it was still actionable, but there's no way I would defame him nationally on my own without investing a lot of money in a printing press and printing out maybe leaflets, or maybe going to the New York Times and convincing them to write an article and then using their press, right? That reality kept defamation from being a widespread problem, right? Because the people with the power to do it had resources and had financial wherewithal that if you sued them, it would hurt them, so they didn't do it. I mean, newspapers had editors who made sure that what they said was true, right? For fear that they would hurt someone's reputation falsely, they'd get sued and then they'd get put out of business. And so, that system kind of took care of itself because of physics, right? Because it's hard to defame a lot of people when the way you defame people is on television, on the radio, or in newspapers, and they control the access. Internet blew that up, right? All of a sudden you could go on a message board, even in the 80s on a computer bulletin board, or Usenet in the internet, or then in some of the walled systems, AOL and CompuServe and Prodigy, which were basically commercialized message boards, and you could sit there with no cost at all and type a message that maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people could see, and you could do real damage to someone's reputation. All of a sudden, defamation became a poor person's game, right? People with no resources, not publishers, not media conglomerates, but like a kid somewhere could defame you, and they did. It wasn't like, if you were an early internet message board users, you remember the flame wars, people don't have any qualm. And by the way, there's another physics thing going on there too. I could defame you guys in a small room like this. When you're here, I could say, Sandra is a pedophile, right? But I run the risk of Sandra coming over and hitting me in the face because I'm lying about him and, impugning his integrity, right? But if Sandro is just a guy out in cyberspace somewhere, I don't have the physical risk of physical retaliation. I don't have any cost to get that message out, and I can write that, and people did, right? And those types of things were happening in all kinds of areas, and in every one of them where you saw a problem like that develop, we saw the legal system struggle to deal with it. So we'll talk defamation as one example, right? It was the amount of defamation, really damaging defamation that occurred in society, if you could chart it, and I don't think the data is there to chart it, but look something like this forever, and then in about 1990 or so, went like, crazy high. There was defamation happening everywhere online. People were lying about each other, making stuff up, hurting reputations, think like Yelp reviews on steroids, right? People saying really horrible, untrue things that could have a real effect. And so there was like, people, what do I do? I've just been defamed online. And there was a lot of thinking, like, what's the right answer to that? And one argument, which I actually wrote an article about once, was like, well, we just need to change the defamation law because it's really easy to do. And there's also something else happening, which is the same thing that enabled the defamation to be so easy enables the aggrieved person to set the record straight. It used to be if the New York Times said you were a thief and you're not, you're screwed because you don't have a printing press and you can't undo the damage. But if it's online, maybe you just get online and respond and say, no, I'm not. That's false. Here's the evidence. And I could rebut the defamatory message right away. Maybe that means online defamation just isn't as bad because the defamed person can reply. Maybe, right? Maybe they didn't know it happened. Maybe they didn't see it. Maybe the damage was done before they replied. Maybe no one read the reply. And so then there was the other thing was like, well, then they could just sue. They can sue the person who said that. Except there's a logistical, physical problem with that too. It's like, who are they? Where are they? How do I find them? What if it's like under their hacker handle, no name associated with it, and the code doesn't give me definitive information about how to find them? I can't sue them.
You might end up suing a fake parody Twitter cow account before you know.
Right. Yeah, Devin Nunez's cow, right? So then, like, what's the next instinct? Well, and this is exactly what happened. There was like, well, somebody's running these machines. Someone's powering this. If this happens on CompuServe, I'll sue CompuServe. They let it happen there, right? And in fact, there was a whole bunch of early litigation suing internet service providers, system operators, online services like CompuServe and Prodigy and AOL for the defamatory messages that people would post on those systems. That's a problem, right? Because if in fact, and you trust me, I'll tell you as an assumption, there was a lot of that. If those system operators have to be responsible for the messages posted by their users, the economic models die. They can't make any money because all it takes is one idiot getting on there and defaming somebody and saying, this restaurant, I went there and they have rats in the kitchen or something totally false. Restaurant takes a hit, they sue the service provider's on the hook for that. Those lawsuits, there would be an infinite number of them. Just defending the lawsuits alone would cost too much, right? The law didn't work here. We just had no remedy for this, right? First instinct the service providers had was, let's police all the content for defamatory messages. Impossible, right? Doesn't work. Unless you know the facts, you don't even know if it's defamatory. Because it is not illegal to say the restaurant has rats in the kitchen if they have rats in the kitchen. In fact, it's more than not illegal, it's protected speech, right? You can't be punished for that. If you say they have rats in the kitchen when they don't, though, you can be. And so the system operator at first were like, we'll police, we'll read all the messages, and we'll figure out which ones are bad, and that doesn't work at all, right? So what's the next move the system operators do? It's like, well, we need to change the law. Like, we shouldn't be considered like the New York Times is a publisher where they have editors working to make sure that stories are false, and if they get it wrong, they should be punished. We should be immunized for what our users say, right? And that's an interesting development, very different than what the law of defamation used to say, which is the publisher was responsible, right? There was an early movement to say, give us immunity for what people say. And the first kickback from the policymakers was, okay, as long as you don't edit. Because if you do edit, then you are like the New York Times, right? But that had a really perverse effect. What effect does that have?
I'm not going to edit anything.
How
horrible
no matter what it is, because if I start messing with the content, right, then I get on the hook for the content. And it had the absolute opposite effect, because in fact, AOL and CompuServe and the big message boards at the time did edit, because they wanted kids to feel safe there or whatever. And for a little bit, their answer was, well, if we get in trouble for editing, then we need to be hands off, and the systems got really rancid. I mean, there's all kind of crap coming through them, right? And so we just had to be creative, and in fact, Congress, in a moment of enlightenment, was creative and said, you know what? You're immunized for what your users do, regardless of how much you edit, right? We want to encourage you to edit. Editing can't get you in trouble, but we also know that it doesn't work to hold you responsible for what users do. If someone wants to sue the person, they sue the user. They respond online, but we're going to immunize the service providers, the internet service providers, the system hosts, all those people. And that's what the law developed. But that's a big difference than where we were. And by the way, that very law, Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act from 1993 or 4 or something, is in the headlines today because we have very powerful platforms like Twitter and Facebook and others who are exercising their rights to say, we're going to clean up what we view is stuff we don't want in our system under our perspective and keep our immunity at the same time, right? So Twitter can say, I don't like Donald Trump's messages, off. You can't publish here. But there's a tremendous response to that with people saying, well, wait a minute, why are you able to do that? That's a First Amendment violation, true or false?
Not a
False.
First Amendment violation.
Yeah, First Amendment says the government shall not, infringe your speech right, not Twitter can't, right? And then they say, well, if you're going to do that, then you should be held responsible, but we get back to that same problem, right? These are hard issues. I mean, there's not a clear-cut, societally accepted balance that we know, and there's a lot of people say, well, that's fine for small systems, but Twitter is really big. They're kind of like the government now, which is a dangerous thing to say. I think it's a slippery slope argument to say we should constrain Twitter like the federal government is constrained. But I understand the motivation, right? There's, you may not have a problem with Twitter banning Trump because of your politics, but would you have what if they said, let go across the aisle and ban some other viewpoint that you might feel more favorably about or something, right? At some point, it hits home to people and they say, we've got to strike a balance. But we are smack dab in the middle of still trying to figure out the proper policy, and that's one small example. Trust me when I tell you, if you think about it, there are 1,000 examples like that where the behaviors in that environment pose challenging problems, and we don't know the legal answer for the right policy for that. I'll give you another favorite one of my favorite examples of this, and it's particularly relevant with the emergence of immersive virtual environments, MMOs, the metaverse, these types of.
And I'll actually quickly sidebar because we did have one online question.
Okay.
I think may tie into this directly.
Okay, I'll take it.
The question was, is the government ready to regulate the metaverse, and what will be the major legal issues we'll see in regards to
Right where I was going. So, right, metaverse, to use that phrase, but I kind of like virtual environments better, pose some of these issues in spades. Because, if you think about what virtual environments are, and the metaverse will be, I guess, one of the big drivers to those environments is that they mimic a lot of physical environments, which makes them compelling. The more realistic they are in some ways, the more social interactions that happen in the real world can happen there, the more compelling they can be, right? And so if you form relationships in the real world with people, you do business in the real world, you can fall in love in the real world, you can play games in the real world. If you can do those things with people who aren't physically near you in an environment that, mimics reality and looks real and feels real or whatever, there's a lot of enticement to use those systems because you can be sitting alone in the North Pole and socially interacting with other people, doing business with them, playing games with them, or whatever. And that's the financial motivation for these virtual environments, is to bring people into the system, maybe sell them access, maybe sell them things once they're in there, maybe sell them virtual things, which is even more interesting, right? But there's a big financial motivation to create these alternative places that aren't really places, they're virtual, right? But there's a bunch of weird things that happen when you create a shadow reality, if you want to think about it that way, a layer on a virtual reality on top of the real reality. Give you some examples, okay? Yeah,
Could you repeat
I
the
will.
question?
Sure.
Yeah. So my question here is, with those world existing, there's two pieces. The government, the physical government is going to want some taxation there, right?
Absolutely.
So maybe at the periphery of it, but then within those worlds, there'll be specific laws. There are copyright laws. You can use it only this NFT versus that one. So it becomes its own government, right?
Yeah, well, that's kind of where I'm going, but I'll use a couple of examples to highlight the difficulty of that. And sorry, the question was, aren't we going to see the emergence of rules specific to those environments? And that, are there going to be their own law? Example, take I won't use a real game, but let's just say there's, Fantasyland. It's a massively immersive, persistent virtual place where you can go play a game, maybe like a World of Warcraft or a Minecraft or something like that, but where people can go and, live out a, fantasy game type experience, right? Well, we know that in order for it to mimic reality and feel real, one of the things that can be done, and it happens kind of on its own, is that some of the basic economic concepts develop quickly in those environments to make it feel real. So for example, in Fantasyland, there might be a really powerful sword that helps you defeat the enemy. And if the game makers figured out a long time ago, if I make that sword scarce, right, then people are going to want it. They may actually pay for it. And in fact, even if they're paying for it in fake game currency, monopoly dollars, so to speak, right? Quickly people realize that outside of that environment, you can exchange the real currency for fake currency. And so the real currency starts having a value. There's exchanges that develop, right? And so there's interesting questions as you have enough parts of the real world elements in these virtual environments. Like, let's say that the scarce sword in Fantasyland has developed value, which these scarce digital items do, right? And maybe you could go on eBay and purchase it on, with real American dollars for $100. And let's say my character, if the code allows it, which if it's a well-developed system might, my character sneaks into your character's hut and takes the sword, right? If that happened in the real world, there's no question about the morality of that. There's no question about the illegality of that. It's theft. You go to jail. They put you in a cage for that. What do you think about someone in the fantasy game going into the hut and stealing the sword? Should that be illegal the same way stealing, a TV set from someone's house is? Seriously, does anyone think that should also be illegal?
It's funny because, as you just correctly pointed out, that sword might have real monetary value.
100%.
So I may have hurt them just as much financially
I don't think.
if I sold their real
I
sword.
don't think you may. I think we can probably safely say you did hurt them
Right.
as much,
Except-
maybe more.
Except what's so weird is, and I think most of us may agree, it feels like, okay, fine, maybe that should be illegal, but it also feels like it maybe shouldn't be punished as harshly as stealing your real sword.
What if we change the scenario a little bit and the name of the game is?
Some games are actually based around doing illegal.
I was going to say, you were right where I was going. What if we just change the name of the game to Thief World, and the idea is how good of a thief are you? And that's the game, right?
Or what if we change the name to EVE Online and the whole point is
Right.
to screw people
Right.
over as hard as
Right. Then do we still feel that going in the game, the rules allow it? You go steal the guy's sword at night. Do we still feel comfortable saying that in the morning the actual police show up at your house and arrest you for stealing a sword? And if not, why not? What is it that happened there that we say, yes, there was real economic damage. Yes, you didn't have their permission to steal it, right? but yet we don't feel good about putting you in jail for that. Why? Because it happened in a game? Maybe, right? That's not a crazy answer. It seems like a flippant answer. Oh, that's just a game, right? In fact, it turns out that, put computers aside for a minute, we got games like that all over the place. I'll give you an example, right? In the real world, if I tell you, listen, you really should buy my house. It's got no foundation problem. The foundation's perfect. And you say, great. And you pay me a bunch of money for my house. You bring an inspector out the next day after the deal happens. He looks and says, this foundation's warped. It's terrible. You overpaid. What is that called? Anyone? Lawyers know what that's called. Fraud. We've decided, not societally cool to do that. And in fact, so much so that if it can be criminal, you can go to jail for lying about that. Go to a car dealer and they say this car gets 80 miles to the gallon. You're like, that's great. And you get it home and it does 23 miles to the gallon. That's illegal. You can't do that, okay? So say we're sitting down playing cards for money, which can be legal some places, in Vegas or whatever. And I say, I don't have anything. I got crap in my hand. You should bet. And you look at me and you're like, okay. Or even the converse, which is more likely in the actual game. I wouldn't bet if I were you. I've got the aces, right? And the person's like, yeah, he says he's got the aces. Folds. I turn over my cards and I show you I don't have anything. I have twos. What do we call that? Bluffing. It's applauded, right? But I also took your money with a false statement. That's no different than a false statement about my foundation or the mileage on the car. Yet in that setting, if you were to sue me for fraud, you would lose. Why?
Game.
Because, yeah, it's the game.
Well, I guess we consented to those rules.
So that has to be the answer, right? Is that we know when we sit down at a poker table that that's an environment where fraud is okay, right? There are lots of games in the real world have that characteristic. Another example, if we finish this, we're all hanging out outside, and then I just get angry and I rush over, pick you up, and throw you to the ground. That's battery. It's a crime, right? If we're wearing a helmet and a jersey and we're doing it at a football field, the crowd cheers when I do that. And it's not battery, right? Because in that environment, we all consented that there's activities that would otherwise be illegal, and we've waived our right to say that's no longer a violation of the law, okay? And people can do that. You can waive your rights. Not always, by the way. The law says sometimes you can't. And by the way, it gets complicated because you can if you're a kid, because we don't think kids have the wherewithal to do that. But generally, adults can enter into consensual situations where they allow others to break the law with them and promise they're not going to enforce the law. So maybe in Thief World, that's what's going on. Is like, we're all playing Thief World. We know what can happen there. We know you can steal swords that have real monetary value. And maybe then we say, no, that's like football or poker or any other number of games. When you're in game play, there's a consent going on where everyone agrees, and therefore it's legal there when the same activity. And that seems like it could make sense, except there's a big difference. When you play poker, you play football, the rules are really clear. You know, not everything goes in poker. If I have an ace up my sleeve and pull it out and pretend like it, that still breaks the rules. There's moral attachment to that. The casino will kick you out of there, and in Nevada, you go to jail for that, right? There are certain things that the rules say you can't do. In football, the moment when the referee blows the whistle, if one player runs over and tackles the other, that is battery. That is illegal, and you do go to jail for that. It's before the whistle that it's not. Why? Because we have rules that say this is when the game's happening, this is how we play it. There's certain hits that are allowed, certain hits that are not, right? And they're not just kind of rules. They're written down clearly. Everyone knows them. But you've been in MMOs. Where are the rules? You know, people say, the terms of service. I write terms of service. Trust me. They don't talk about whether you can steal stuff. They don't talk about any of that stuff. They say don't share your password, right? They don't get into that level of detail about the interactions in those environments. And so it's easy to say it's the equivalent to these consent environments where people knowingly consented to these bad acts and waived their right to enforce them. But what if I say, yeah, I just signed up, there was no rule set, I didn't know you could steal swords, I wouldn't have spent $10,000 on this special sword if I know people could steal it, now I'm out 10,000 bucks, I didn't consent, right? Which means we've got to fix that gap somehow. Either we have to say, here are the detailed rules for social interactions in, by the way, in like sandbox type games where you can do anything, and here's what's okay there maybe that you do consent to, and then here's what's not okay. And by the way, if we do that, what are we going to write? I mean, what are the rules? Who decides that? The game publisher? The players? Who figures out what's cool in Game of Thieves, Land of Thieves, or whatever I called it, and what's not? And if we sit down to write all those rules, are we just rewriting the law? Yeah. Do we just take all the same laws and maybe like cross one or two out? The bluffing's okay here, but it's not, because no one's doing that. Those rules are not clear. They're not established by any stretch. And we are on a fast track to moving our lives, our businesses, our social engagements into those environments that don't have clear rule sets. We don't know what the rules are, right? And it's not just, stealing virtual items. It's taxes. It's gambling, it's pornography, it's copyright issues. Pretty much every area of the law, right, has issues translating into these virtual environments where we don't know, and by the way, there's no clear rule set, and the current law doesn't apply, and the natural reaction of participants in those arenas is, well, there's just no law. It's all free. But there's big money over there now. There's real interactions. People can get really hurt, you might feel one way about it. You think, oh, it's just some gamer, he knows what's going on. But what if it's a kid who gets swindled out of a bunch of real money by an adult in one of those environments? Do we say, oh, that was a kid, therefore that is illegal, as opposed to an adult? And why is that the case? What if the kid's the swindler, right? Which is probably more likely, taking advantage of some, rich old lady who doesn't know what she's doing, right? There's a whole bunch of permutations of this problem that are not theoretical anymore. They're happening right now with real-world impacts, real-world damages. People's lives are getting destroyed over this, financially and otherwise, and we have no idea really how to regulate that fairly. We just don't. I mean, we kick back to the real world laws and they don't feel right. We look for rules and laws in those environments, they don't exist. It's like, it's like what it must have been like when people came to unsettled continents where there was no government and no rules, and we just kind of had to create from scratch new methods of governance. So one answer to your question is, maybe we will see in these virtual environments the emergence of rules. Like first as norms, because there are norms, right? You go and you start being an idiot in one of these places and the other players all shun you and maybe even take collective action against you, shut you down, kill you, kill you because you're ruining the game. But there's still no rules. Maybe we say, those players eventually say, well, let's just write out the rules so newbies know what the rules are. And then if there's ambiguity, maybe we let this guy who's an experienced player figure it out. And we should let the accused make their argument, and we should make the accuser has to make their argument, and then let the judge. I mean, all of a sudden we're recreating. Maybe we do that. Maybe we say, but in thief world, thievery is okay. We all agree. So that's not going to be a problem. But hate speech isn't okay because that's lame, and we don't want people doing that. So let's not, and maybe we create a whole set of rules there. Do we do that democratically? Do we do that with votes? Do we just let the game publishers figure that out? We let the players figure that out? I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions. And it's kind of weird to think that we might have different rule sets each time you enter into a different virtual environment, right? Like, oh, this is a place where hate speech is okay. This is a place where it's not. right? I mean, what are you gonna do, like read the law before going into each one of those? We don't have to do that in the real world because we kind of know where we are, right? We know one set of rules applies. This is a problem that is not, again, not theoretical, it's happening right now. It's huge amounts of money. If you follow some of the more interesting hype technologies out there like cryptos and NFTs, it's littered with this problem. You know, people have no idea what rules actually apply. You know, Sandra and I just finished representing Larva Labs, which is the creator of the CryptoPunks, and their sale to Yuga, right? There's a lot going on there with people thinking they have very valuable intellectual property that they don't actually have.
You mean like people who think that buying a rare Dune book equals they have copyright? Those people?
You know, a lot of money went into that deal, right? People thinking, and there are two ways to look at it. There's the conservative lawyer way. We look at it and say, we know the copyright law. You buy one of these avatars. The NFT for one doesn't mean you're buying the intellectual property any more than when you go to the bookstore and buy a copy of Dune. You don't own Dune. You own a piece of paper that Dune's written on, right? And you can't go make a TV series about Dune. You can't say, oh, this is a great book. I'm going to print out 10,000 copies and sell them myself. Those are all illegal. There's very bright lines there. So our instinct, a lot of lawyers' instincts, is like, well, that's obviously the same rules that apply there, right? Except you have a community of people who see it totally different. Sometimes on both sides of the equation, the publishers of those properties don't think like traditional copyright owners. The purchasers of those properties don't think like traditional copyright purchasers. Everyone, they had a different understanding that doesn't comport with the law. And so are we really going to say the solution to disputes there is to bring in a law that no one acknowledged or no one was working under and apply it in that circumstance and maybe screw some people up? Maybe the right rule is, with an NFT, you do get that right. It's not what the copyright law says, but if everyone involved thought you were getting it, maybe there's implied, it's like poker. We agree that that's the way copyright's going to work here. Even that's not the way it works in the real world. But we don't know right now, and it's not trivial money. I mean, it's real money. I believe that most people who buy NFTs have no idea what they're buying. I mean, like literally don't understand what they.
Oh, so it's not just me, because I looked at it all from a coding implementation, and I was like, no, they own a literal hash that's a pointer to the URL on a blockchain. That's all they own. They don't own what's at that URL or what's on that server. Like, no. So.
Yeah, I mean, Sandra and I kicked around this a lot. We talk about this all the time. One of the analogies we've developed that we think is helpful to try to explain what you get when you buy an NFT is about the same thing AT&T got when they bought the right to put their name on the stadium up in Dallas, the AT&T Stadium. They don't own the stadium. They can't rent it out, right? They had the exclusive right to put their name on it, right? They can't go to Jerry Jones and say, hey, I'm going to do an event next week. Sorry. He's going to say, no, you're not. I own the stadium. I'm the one that collects the rent. I pay the taxes. I let you slap your name on it. And yes, it's exclusive to you. Time Warner can't come put their name on it. I gave you naming rights, basically, right?
I mean, yeah, I think I was reading an article that basically was saying, because I couldn't figure out why people were using NFTs for this when technically you wouldn't design it that way if that's what you wanted to use. And I was reading that the people who originally built it, they meant it more to be like a public blockchain version of a Patreon credit scroll thanking supporters for their financial support. That's what it was designed to be. I'm like, well, that makes sense because technically that's what it is.
That's all it is. And by the way, it's a cool technology because it is, a distributed ledger and that has accountability and we know who owns it, et cetera. And there are scenarios for the implementation of that on top of the existing legal system that could create new revenue streams. If you're the Beatles copyright owner, whoever they are now, I think it's McCartney again, but whoever owns the copyright to all the Beatles stuff, right? We know how you make your money. You can, you get licensing rights. If someone wants to put in a commercial, you charge them. You get public performance rights. There's a bunch of revenue streams people buy. They stream it on Spotify. You get like a billionth of a percentage of a penny or whatever the number is, right? But there's established ways of making money. You could imagine the NFT system being used to add an additional revenue stream for those artists. I mean, McCartney, if say he is the owner, I don't know, but I think he is. Could, yeah, he had it. I think they bought it back. I haven't kept track, but whoever the owner is, right, could say, in addition to all of my rights in the music that I have to monetize it, you can't go make copies, you can't stream it without paying me or whatever. But I'll, Let It Be is a cool song. I'll let one collector stamp their name on Let It Be. Doesn't change anything about my rights in Let It Be, just like Jerry Jones didn't change anything about his ownership right of the stadium. But you can say, I'll let somebody buy the right to say, McCartney says, I don't know what the sponsor of, or I'm biggest fan of Let It Be, and by the way, I'll give you that right, and I'll make it transferable. So if a bigger fan comes along and wants to pay more than you paid me for it, they can buy that. There's a revenue stream to be made there. That could be legitimate. There are fans that, I don't know, it'd be kind of cool to say, everyone in the world knows that on the official, roster of fans, I got Let It Be.
Right. I've certainly thought that, there's certain artists where, I could say, I really like that painting you did. I'm going to publicly declare I loved it on the blockchain and give you some money.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not against the technology. I just think a lot of people are delusional.
Right, because there are some,
using it.
because if the IP doesn't transfer in that transaction, which it doesn't, then what keeps me from saying, well, I'll also keep a list of Let It Be fans, right? Which I'm not sure is illegal at all, because I'm not copying the song, I'm not doing anything with it. And I'll keep Ed's list, and I'll sell a spot on my blockchain for each Beatles song as well. Yeah.
So question,
Yeah.
so let's say there's a pointer to the blockchain. Well, blockchain includes a pointer to an image of mine. I can create another NFT pointing to that specific image as well, because again, it's just a pointer, right?
Right?
There is an implication with the copyright law here that the copyright owner might be able to make an NFT that would be illegal, right? Now, anybody can make an NFT that's also legal, and in the middle, there's can I make an NFT of something that's copyrighted, but then give the money to the artist, or is there a way around? And
Not in the current system. At its base level, assigning an association between an item on the blockchain and a copyrighted piece of work is not an infringement, okay? It can be an infringement if you pass along, it can involve the copyright if the owner of a copyrighted work says, when you buy that NFT related to that piece of work, I will also transfer the work to you, right? Then copyright's really involved, right? It would be real different if Paul McCartney said, for Let It Be, the purchaser of that token that I've assigned not only gets the token, but gets the copyright. Now you can make money off Let It Be. Well, okay, but now we're just talking about selling copyrighted works, which you can always do, and using a nice distributed ledger to keep track of that, which is fine. But that's not what most copyright owners are doing with their works. They are basically, they can do whatever they want, but the prevailing model is that they retain all the copyright interest and are just selling this naming right association concept of some type, right? In which case there is no copyright thing going on, which is why anyone can do it, I think. There's some interesting trademark questions we could put aside, but I think that I could also start, I could mint a bunch of NFTs like my favorite sci-fi novels and say, I will, if you like Dune, you can buy my Dune NFT, and I will say that you are the biggest Dune fan. You're not buying Dune. You're not getting any rights to make a Dune movie. You're not getting rights to print the book. You're just on my list of Dune fans, and they'll make it transferable. I can, if I'm the copyright owner, only if I'm the copyright owner, also associate IP rights with that transaction. If I'm Frank Herbert and I own Dune, I could say, I'm going to let Dune out as an NFT and all my other books, and the purchaser now owns the IP. But that's a different deal than what most NFT deals are. Even the crappy, apes and punks and all those things, which have no inherent value, they retain the copyright ownership of all that art. You're just being the unique association with that one particular piece of art. And depending on what model you are, you may not have any rights whatsoever. You might have some limited rights to like at least put it on a t-shirt or put it on your avatar on Twitter or whatever, or you might not. I mean, some of the systems give you no rights to that at all.
A question regarding copyright, if something is copied so many times and it's not been registered, it's almost like public domain, right?
Nope.
It's still almost.
This is one of my favorite,
Okay.
this is a good.
I just wanna know.
Yeah, so the question, if you were online, is, if something gets copied so many times and there's been no registration, isn't it public domain? And the answer is that's just not the way the law works. Maybe that's the way the law should work in virtual environments. That's open for debate, but it's not the way the law works currently. Copyright under the US law in the real world does not require registration to be valid. It happens the moment you create an original expressive work. Registration is useful to make a record of who the owner is, but doesn't change who owns it. And the fact that a lot of people ripped you off with copying it without permission doesn't mean that you lose your rights in it. It could if we rewrote the law to be that, but it's not. So a copyright owner doesn't lose their rights by the fact that there's been a lot of illegal copying, just like McCartney and Lennon didn't lose the rights to Let It Be because 1 million people have copied that file without paying it, right? It would be a weird result to say the more people rip you off, the faster your rights go away. Okay, we haven't struck that deal. That's not the way. And by the way, copyright law is not made by God. It's not a law of physics. This is a man-made law. We could say whatever we want. The balance we've struck, though, through years of precedent and analyzing is you don't lose it because people are ripping you off. You own it, right? The only way something becomes, quote, public domain, which means you have waived your rights in it, is if you expressly say, this is now public domain. Right? I hereby waive my rights. I say everyone's free to do whatever you want with it. I will not, I won't prosecute you. I will not sue you. And it's really just a waiver. It's like, and if you do sue them, they have a defense because you defrauded them by saying you wouldn't. And so that's how it works. But absent that agreement to allow something to be public domain, copyright works don't slip in the public domain on their own footnote, except for the term of the copyright, right? And which used to be the life of the author, but then like powerful lobbyists got involved and said that's not long enough because the authors die and we want to keep making money off of it, like Disney and others, and you know, and the Sonny Bono Term Extension Act, which pushed it even further. Sonny Bono, if you don't know the story, it's almost too good to be true. Sonny Bono was Sonny of Sonny and Cher, the singing duo, went on to have a career as a senator and made it his priority as a legislator to extend the copyright term for a really long time.
Is it still 70 years?
It's so long that I don't know it, and I'm a copyright lawyer. It is.
It is so long that we only now started having things enter the public domain again, and I think we're up to 1925 just entered the public domain.
We just got Steamboat Willie.
We got Steamboat Willie, I think, but
We also got Hemingway's first novel finally.
yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bunch of stuff in the public domain, really old stuff. What I tell people,
The author plus 70 years.
life of the author plus 70 years, although there's a lot of really tricky ways to make that infinite. You add a little bit to it, create a new copyright interest. Mickey Mouse is never going to go in the public domain, even though it's really old and Walt Disney's dead. Trust me, Disney knows how to work the copyright law. You will never, get Mickey Mouse rights because they don't want you to ever get them. Right?
Similar to that, maybe A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh is now in the public domain.
But the
Disney's
Disney
Pooh
Winnie
will
the
never be in
The little yellow fat one with the red shirt on is not public domain. The one that A.A. Milne wrote in the original children's
The
book,
naked
which
one is
that
not
doesn't look like Winnie the Pooh to anybody but Milne fans, is public domain. But realistically, it's it's probably most valuable copyrighted stuff is you won't see it. You'll die first, right? So building a business around, but it doesn't get you there because people do it. So you have this problem, right? And it's a rampant problem because, you're obviously interested enough to be sitting here listening to me rant about this. You care about the law, and that's not clear rule to you. I guarantee you that rule is not clear to the population at large, And it's definitely not clear to all the people who are buying NFTs thinking they're getting ownership of the copyrighted material. And it raises an interesting question of whether maybe when everyone's got it wrong, maybe the law's wrong, not them, right? But that's not an inconsequential decision to make.
Well, if they're right, then that means that now my browser would be forced to not let me right-click save.
Right.
What I was gonna say, like you said it earlier, but I think it's really interesting is, copyright law in the past was really there to protect artists, and there was incentive there, and so there was like a kind of a higher, at least we looked at the law from why the purpose of the law, like why do you want to do this law, who are you protecting, it was very clear. When you apply this to like the NFT world, having talked to publishers, having talked to like the owners of crypto, whatever, they have a different incentive model. Like the way NFTs become valuable is to then get put out there and get adopted. And so like they actually, in some ways, they don't care about protecting copyright. In some ways, we want them to like be as adopted as possible. And so like even trying to lock them down, and so I think part of the reason why they haven't cared so much to get it right or clarify that is because they don't care about
It's not part of their business model, right?
Yeah, their business model is like, we need to become the most popular ape, most popular dog, most popular whatever. And so, I don't know who you're protecting.
Well, this is the issue, right, is that because it's a man-made system that is intended to keep people from getting hurt, right? I mean, we have to, as lawyers and legislators and policymakers and concerned people, recognize when everyone involved is okay with a system that's not the same as what the law says. And maybe no one's getting hurt over there by it. And in that case, maybe the law is just outdated, right? Maybe the law is stupid, right? Except you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and they say, okay, now in copyright world, if everyone's copying it a bunch, then you just lose your copyright because there are really valuable copyrights that would go away and you would cause immeasurable damage to McCartney or independent artists or whatever who don't have the ability to police. I mean, it's just not a simple problem.
Some of it's solved now in the royalty system, right? Because it's like, now that if you can put in the royalty in the smart contract, now it's in the code, and then let's say that in the world there's actually fully executable, we talk about this a lot. The royalty system isn't perfect yet, but it could be, right? Like these digital assets, if they continue this royalty, like that could solve the problem. Who you protect? You can protect them by keeping them a royalty down the line. You don't no longer have to have laws. It's not.
Yeah, smart contracts alone are fascinating, right? Because, remember when I talked about how, when the law is not there, the code takes over? The smart contract is exactly that. It's the programmer saying, I don't know how the law treats this stuff, but I'm going to code it into the system how it has to be treated. Like, here's what it means to transfer ownership of an item on the chain. If you use the new standard, and a royalty must pass to this person. Not because necessarily there's a valid legal contract that says that, or a valid property right that says that, but because the code that facilitates the transfer hard codes that into it. You can't transfer it without that happening under the system, right? It is the perfect example of the conflation of computer code and legal code. And like the programmer saying, screw the legal code, I don't know what the law says about this. I'm just gonna hard code it into the system.
Except this is when I, the programmer, then have to go, but then what is the legal remedy for if there was a bug in my smart contract?
Yeah, good luck. I mean, I don't know. Or does a smart contract's existence indicate consent by the parties to that rule set, even if they're not in line with the legal actual
Or
law?
does it indicate consent to what my code actually does, not what I thought it did?
Right. If I hard code in a 50% royalty because of a typo, do I go back to regular contract law and say, oh, that wasn't the intent of the parties, there's a mistake there? Or do I say, no, the smart contract rules, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues there. And programmers didn't just wait, they didn't wait for the law to catch up to any of that. They're like, we'll just put it in. And by the way, there's a lot of code that functions that way, where, programmers who believe that the privacy laws are not strong enough to prohibit people from snooping on your private information, they just write the communication to be encrypted. I don't care what the law says. I don't care if law enforcement thinks they have a right to do this or not. I'll just make it impossible for them. I'll just change the laws of physics. That message can't be read by anyone but the recipient. I don't care what the law says, right? I mean, this happens in all types of areas. The programmers, the user community, the networks are so far ahead of the law keeping up that they compensate for those shortcomings by coding in rule sets that are the analog of the law of physics in the real world, right? To effectuate what they think should happen, right? What they think is the just result, and screw the law of the real world. I don't care if you think you have the right government to read this message because the Fourth Amendment allows in this circumstance or not this circumstance. I'm just going to make it impossible for the government to read that message. And by the way, what's the government's reaction to that? We'll make crypto illegal then, cryptography illegal, right? Because that's a tool that we shouldn't allow people to have. It goes back to the same underlying premise that Lessig thought, which is if you can't curb behavior with law in virtual environments, then they're going to start regulating the code in virtual environments, right? And so,
This is, of course, then when I push back as a programmer, where I'm like, well, if you make my Turing machine no longer a Turing machine, it's not useful
Yeah.
anymore. If you make it where I can't run any executable code, it's not a computer anymore.
right. I mean, again, all really fascinating thought problems, but real world implications happening in an increasing amount right now, and really coming, in much bigger numbers and impact in the next, year, 2, 3, where we see a mass migration of business and social activity into these environments, which are legally ambiguous. We just don't know what's going to happen.
What do you think the timetable is on, if we were gonna look at virtual environments, and compare it to 1993, Eternal Summer, everybody starts getting on the World Wide Web? How long until we're at the 1993 of these virtual worlds? When's it gonna stop being rich geeks playing in there? When does it go mainstream?
So I think it's probably more mainstream than we want to acknowledge right now. Look, the internet is a virtual environment, so we're all on the net all the time, and
Right,
so
it's a mediated
right.
virtual
So it's not very rich, right? It's not Ready Player One,
Right.
which what people kind of think what it's going to look like, right? But that's coming too, But if depending on how you define it, we're already there.
All right, I'll amend.
Yeah.
How long until something like AltSpace VR is not just rich nerds with Oculus headsets? When is everybody in AltSpace VR? Or will that not happen?
So I'm not the technologist, I'm the lawyer, but I think that's coming. I think all the economic incentives there. Here's what we are noticing. Chandra and I work in this area all the time. I saw this with the internet and didn't recognize for what it was when it happened, but in retrospect, it was definitely, as you guys know, the internet wasn't created by any company or anyone. It was created by a hugely distributed, unorganized group of smart people who, in order for it to work, started realizing that you needed some standards, right? If the emails were going to get from one place to the other, if the website was going to display properly, proprietary standards don't work for that. And so someone just comes along and says, well, here's the way, all browsers should interpret that image, or here's the way email addressing should work, right? But that wasn't the government that came up with that. It wasn't academia necessarily came up with that. It was just kind of like an autonomous general agreement towards those standards. And then people had commercial interest to develop various parts of it. But because of the underlying standard infrastructure, at the lowest level TCP/IP, at the higher levels, code levels like HTML and now APIs and stuff, right? It all of those aggregated things worked together to form the net. It's not owned by anybody. Different parts maybe are owned and proprietary, but a lot of it's even non-proprietary, whatever, right? And by the way, if you think about that as a human endeavor, it's pretty amazing. It's like probably the most disruptive technology in the history of mankind. Was not created by an evil genius company or, the government or whatever, but was created by a hugely dispersed, unorganized group of people with commercial and other interests just kind of happened, right? But when it was happening, I mean, I was working in this space in the late 90s, mid 90s, later 90s. It looked like chaos. We mocked a lot of it. Like, that's what a stupid idea. That's going to fail. Look at all that venture money getting burnt on this crappy idea. You know, I mean, we can all link back to like total failures, you know, standards that didn't get picked up, you know, technologies that didn't succeed. And it looked chaotic and crazy and stupid. But then you pull back 20 years and it's like, oh, that was working. The same way like evolution looks really crappy and unorganized and stupid, and species die off and come out and, you know, all that stuff. And yet we get a human eye out of like a single-celled organism, right? It kind of just immutably works to creating this thing. There's no doubt in my mind that, depending on how you define it, but the metaverse, this rich, sensory, realistic simulation environment, we're seeing the same thing happen right now. Everyone in the world's working on this. Every client that I deal with in multiple areas, not just my video game clients, and I represent those guys, but every technology company is all kind of working on different parts of it. The standards are promulgating right now. It's going to work. If you don't believe that, just read like the news today. You know, there are certain companies that stumbled into having a really advantageous position of this. The game companies are an industry that got a lead on this because they were doing it in a lot of different ways. And if you know enough about game programming, you know there's like really 2 or 3 big engines out there. You know, Epic, their Unreal Engine powers a lot of those environments. Unity powers a lot of them. Epic raised $2 billion of venture capital today. An infusion of $2 billion into Epic for, in recognition that they're well positioned to promulgate a cohesive platform across virtual environments to bring them together, right? There's real money coming into this right now. Is the Epic Unreal Engine going to be the underlier of the metaverse? Maybe. Or is it going to be some version of it? Who knows? Will there be one? Yes. Can we predict it now? No, but it's coming, right? Because there's too much financial incentive, too much human interest in developing those environments. So when is it coming? I don't know. I mean, you know, the video game industry is larger than the music, film, and book industry combined already. And one might argue that that is already that industry, right? It is the #1 entertainment industry on the planet. And in some cultures, more than here, it's ubiquitous amongst, you know, people. If you don't believe that, go to Korea and see their culture, which is a gaming culture. Adults, children, old people, young people immersed in video game environments already. It's coming here too. I don't know where you define when, but it's not like we haven't started. We're well on the path to that. And the law is super far behind in adapting to those environments. I mean, not even close.
I mean, the law question I immediately think of is there going to be an equivalent of virtual borders in the metaverse of different legal zones, and how much one-to-one analog with real physical country borders will there be or not be?
Totally unknown, I think, right? I don't even know how you would, even if you thought it was a good idea to say we need to have different legal regimes in the metaverse the way we do in the physical world, how you would map that and know, you know, what that means, I think is very difficult. You know, and by the way, has real implications because, for example, we have freedom of speech in this country. It's constitutional. We protect a lot of speech. That's a minority rule in the world. Even our people in Western culture that we think are like us don't have it. You don't get it in Canada or the UK, you know.
Definitely don't. There was even a news story that recently came out of the UK where, like, for all the people, you know, who get angry about Twitter moderating what they can say, there was somebody who, like, wished death upon a veteran on Twitter in the UK, and the government punished him. They fined him and sentenced him to
Right,
community
and
service.
so-
That would be a blatant first
So
amendment
as we used to say back in the early days, you know, the First Amendment is like a local ordinance and a weird one on the internet. It's not the majority rule, right? But as Americans, and particularly American lawyers, we happen to like that rule. we think freedom of speech is good for democracy, et cetera. I think there are good arguments for that. And I would want to see free speech, policy across the metaverse. But that's the minority view. I mean, that's not what the rest of the world thinks. Maybe, laws restricting speech become the norm on the metaverse, and the fact that we have a First Amendment here, it's relegated to irrelevance because people in the metaverse say, no, there's certain things you can't say, and if you do, you go to jail for those things, which sounds real, it seems really problematic to us, but there are more people that think a free speech regime would be problematic to them. They win if there's votes, right? And we have, where do you draw the lines? Maybe each system has its own rule set. Maybe it's user generated. There is, I think, a fascinating possibility that different parts of the metaverse will self-regulate and develop their own legal regimes with their own dispute resolution and their own justice systems, and that some combination of corporate interest or maybe user interest or whatever just create those, like, hey, we want one where hate speech is okay, and not the rest of the metaverse, but this zone, we want to be free to bully people or whatever, right? Or child pornography is okay in this area of the metaverse, right? There are certainly enough people that might get together and say, well, we were going to create our little corner of the metaverse where that's okay, And if that kind of happens, where we get fragmented, like little governance zones across the metaverse, it's pretty fascinating because the emergence of a new legal regime for a country is a fairly rare thing, right? There aren't that many countries. There aren't that many sets of laws. They don't come around very often, right? That experiment is a slow-moving one, right? Ours is a relatively new one in 200 years or 300 years, right? But imagine a world where we had this kind of experiment of thousands of them just kind of happening all the time. Maybe we find the better one that way. I don't know.
So then that gets into so the internet was very decentralized back in the 90s and 2000s. It is now centralized in a few large platforms, and a lot of the concerns about these free speech debates are, okay, fine, Twitter and Facebook can moderate how they want, it's not a First Amendment violation, but if there's 3 platforms where all online discourse is happening, that clearly still seems a problem. You talk about thousands of little metaverse countries. What's going to prevent one metaverse country from invading another and gobbling them up until we have a few major empires, just like happened in the real world?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the loss of our decentralization on the internet. I'm increasingly concerned about the emergence of dominant players. I'm not sure how to avoid that because, you can start your own Facebook or whatever, but if there's no one there, there's no value. Network effect economics make it valueless unless there's a critical mass of others there. It doesn't do good to go update your profile pic or put pictures of your kid's birthday. If there's no one there to see them, you're not going to do it, right?
What do you think about proposed solutions like the Access Act that basically say make social media federated technology like email, where using Facebook is not using Facebook, you're using the Facebook client on the social media protocol? Do you think that will fix a lot of problems, or will it make new problems?
I think I worry about legislating that. I think the market might do that on its own. If you ask me to pull back one abstraction level, I think the emergence of these walled gardens may end up being a temporary bad turn in the technological development, and that there may be enough market and economic and social pressure to say a more equitable, better, decentralized system becomes important enough that maybe even those guys joining eventually, right? I don't know whether that's going to happen. I'm worried about regulating it because I don't trust any regulators to know how to do that. And those laws seem to me probably would be a disaster the day they were written. They'd be outdated the next day. So will it take care of itself? Possibly. And we see some signs of that. What people now call crypto, I have to get used to it having a narrower meaning than it used to. But, decentralized finance, which seems to be catching on, albeit a lot of stupidity there too. But But again, any of these things look stupid early, and a lot of it is stupid, but the good stuff seems to emerge out of it, right? Is maybe a version of that. Who would have thought it was going to happen with money, you know? But there are decentralized protocols in that arena. I don't see why there might not be similar pressures to create decentralized protocols in social networking, in other arenas where, you know, now the incumbents might fight that, just like the incumbents are fighting DeFi pretty hard, and they control the current real world legislatures a lot better than, you know, the crypto punk type people out there do. And so there's a battle, but maybe that does happen. I don't know if that's better or not, but it seems to me to be better.
But that's the First Amendment, the second portion, the petition, right?
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean,
so anyone with money can actually twist the law towards their benefit, right?
yeah, I mean, I like to have a little bit more faith that the law also has, you know, a mind of its own, but there's no question that money's heavily involved in it. I mean,
Napster was a great idea. It got shut down by money.
Right.
Real world, not money. Not
yeah, but I mean, I was pretty involved in that, having involved in litigation. What really killed Napster was that they didn't keep up with the economic model of proprietary streaming systems like Spotify. I used Napster. Spotify's way better. All the music's there. It's labeled properly. There's no viruses. I don't have to jump through all kinds of.
I don't have to buy a new, bigger hard drive every time.
I mean, and they priced it so cheap at the artist's detriment or whatever that I just am not motivated to pirate music anymore, right? I mean, the law had an initial backlash against peer-to-peer copyright systems. I litigated those cases. I saw it, but that's not what killed them. What killed them was that there were commercial models that were just better that came out, and you know, the technology's still out there. The enforcement's still bad. If there's plenty of, you can still pirate music online. There's no point when you can pull up any song ever in decent quality for almost nothing. Why do you need to? I mean, I had a huge MP3 collection sitting on a hard drive in a closet somewhere. It's a zero utility, right? So it's not clear that you need the law to solve those problems. The market may solve them on its own, for better or for worse. I mean,
So you believe that DeFi will fix itself before the big money company will come in and be like, well, Visa or banks?
or they adopt it and commercialize it and before it fixes itself. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that's all left to be seen. We have seen, you know, new models on the commercial side, the proprietary side. The cost to the consumer is plummeting there too. If they bring it low enough, maybe you don't need DeFi. You know, if all of the things that offered you are offered by Goldman Sachs at very low, cost. I don't know. I mean, I think that's unpredictable. But I do worry about, too much power assembling in certain places. Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Google, Amazon. They got a lot of power right now. But so did IBM.
So did MySpace.
So did MySpace, which owned that sector, for a while. So did Lotus 123, which was the predominant spreadsheet when I learned to use spread. These things have a way of changing. So
We only have a little time left, but I would like to circle back to something that sort of ties in to one of the things you talked about earlier that I'm curious. What do you think the risks as we chart out these laws for these new virtual spaces and these new technologies? What are the risks that we're going to basically impose the existing legal structures in places where we don't need to, and it actually creates a more flawed system? I think back to, for example, I wish I thought of it earlier, when you were talking about your example of okay, so the online game where I steal the guy's sword.
Mhm.
Well, the counter might be, well, this is nowhere near as serious as the real world because, it's just code. The game creators can give the guy who lost his sword a new sword, except we're kind of now recreating artificial scarcity in digital environments with things like NFTs and unique cryptographic hashes. are we potentially recreating one of the biggest flaws of the real world, scarcity, in a space that doesn't need it and shouldn't have it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because as I mentioned this in passing, but I put a lot of thought into, I think the motivators on the technological evolution of these systems for deep-seated human reasons are to make them as realistic as possible, which means the way things work in the outside world should should be mirrored there because it feels more engaging. It feels normal to us. And, look, if I have a cherished sword, and we know this from gaming, right? If I have a cherished sword and the publisher puts out, which they can easily, 1,000 of those, that sucks. I worked really hard to get the special sword. They nerfed it on me, right? That's what they term, And so they don't do that because it feels more real to play a game where scarcity matches scarcity rules in the real world, right? Gold is scarce in the real world. I guess putting aside conspiracy theories that people sit on a lot of it, the De Beers or whoever, but there are scarce things in the real world because of physics, and that makes them valuable, land and things like that. But in a world where there can be infinite amount of land, which is what the virtual world is, it just doesn't play as well because we're used to the world where land is scarce. So they create artificial scarcity to match it. I think the economic incentive is to bring in a lot of our stuff from the real world into those worlds so that they're more playable. Now, that's not always true. They also let characters fly, and have superpowers and stuff.
In fairness, right, scarcity, humans attach value to effort and to scarcity. There's a lot of basic psychology going on, but you can transfer that to a domain where it's like, to get back to, say, pirating music online, where it's like, well, the marginal cost of copies is 0. So, the songs bring everyone joy. Why shouldn't it be spread as widely as possible? Why shouldn't
No, it's Andre's point.
exclusive?
At some point, when you change enough of the environment and the economics and the physics and all that, you probably need to revisit the purpose of the original law that you're trying to port over and see that it's still fulfilling its purpose. Right? I happen to believe, I'm not completely convinced, but I think that there's still a value in the copyright law to compensate creatives and artists. Not completely sure that's true, by the way, because we had creatives and artists making beautiful art and stuff before there was a copyright law. So there were other motivators that might be equally important. But I tend to believe that someone creates something beautiful and, that they maybe don't have to get a day job, that they can make money off doing that, right? I want to do that. If we don't create an economic system where they can exclusively exploit that, then it's possible they don't create as much and the world's a bad place.
The argument basically being that, well, we could create a world where artists just get a basic income and then all art can be free, but we don't have that world yet, so the artist has got to eat somehow.
Has got to eat somehow. And I'm even enough of a capitalist to say good artists should make more than bad artists. I want the good art. I want to incentivize that art, right? And so creating a system where artists don't get any reward or get equal reward maybe doesn't work. Maybe it does. Maybe I'm wrong. But I don't think we know how that plays out over there, even if the marginal cost of copying becomes nothing. Maybe we still want to enforce these rules to make digital artists create digital art. Or else maybe the art dries up. Anyway, probably went long enough, longer than I thought I would, but
We are about to get kicked out of the room.
Okay.
Does anybody have a final question for Ed before we call it here?
Do you think there need to be more lawyers pursuing this space, given the high volume, record class?
lawyers have an innate ability to sense where the money is.
Do you speak from experience?
I do. And there's a massive shortage of lawyers that are even thinking about this right now. I teach at the law school, and I tell all my law students right now, it's like, this is what you want to be thinking about, because 5 years, 10 years from now, there's going to be a huge amount of legal work, disputes, understanding all this stuff. There's a mass shortage of lawyers. That's not the worst problem, though. The real problem is there's a massive shortage of legislators and policymakers who understand it, right? I mean, you know, the lawyer's there to deal with the law's not even being written. But yes, there's a dearth, and there was going to be a huge, I mean, actually, I think all lawyers 20, 30 years from now are virtual law lawyers.
And I mean, yeah, the politicians still need educating from EFF. I mean, we have Senator Blumenthal asking, who is FINSTA? You know, like, there's still a lot of education that needs to happen.
Yeah, they get it wrong all the time. All right, well, thanks, guys. That was fun. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. As enlivening as I knew it would be. And thank you all for coming. If any of you feel like maybe sticking around and want to grab a drink somewhere, I'm happy to do that. If you want to chat and get to know us. Also, if any of you park in the garage, the desk should have validation that should make sense. So you should talk to them before you go. But yeah, if anybody wants to go hang out, let me know. Yes, the front, yes. But yeah, if anybody wants to hang out, let me know. We can hang out for a bit.
I mean, they're not,
Chat casually.
well, no, they might need to, but yeah, they go look at all the
Type of link and open source. Collection of apes that are either straight images or.
No, they make